All right. Mike, thanks so much for joining me today here. I would love for us to have a cool little conversation about high performance and in the context of player development. So let's start with the idea of, you've got a player who's really trying to get to an elite level, whether they're a college player, high school player, or mini tour player. What would you say would be kind of a bit of a model or a framework that that player should work from that might help guide where they're spending their time on a daily basis? Love to kind of start with that, and then we can kind of go back and forth a little bit on it.
Yeah, I think a high performance model. We started to get introduced to it. I'd say maybe 15 years ago now, and I think as Canadians, we've been lucky to have been blessed with some really awesome coaches in Canada with our hockey system, right? In talking about really what it takes to develop high performing athletes. And as far as golf goes, we've been learning over the past 15 years of what uh, the best organizations in the world do. In Canada, it's hockey, and Australia, it's cricket and golf. In England, it's soccer, and in most of Europe, it's soccer, South America, etc. But I think as we get more educated and the more science there is out there, we're starting to learn more about the body and how the body learns and how it performs. And so I would say with junior athletes, one of the things that I see a lot is the still the neglect for how important the body is and taking care of the body. I'm seeing, as I'm sure you are, still athletes that are playing golf at a really high level that are incredibly asymmetrical, very deficient in a lot of you know functional patterns, and they start to get to a point where they specialize very early, and then they're getting into a point where they're starting to play really competitive high level golf, and technology has kind of allowed them to become very proficient in the sport, but the body is really not where it needs to be. So I would say my number one thing for a junior athlete is to get somebody on the team that really understands the body, both from our performance and a recovery standpoint. And again, I think going back to old school days is really stay uh, as a kid as long as you can. Play multiple sports for as long as you possibly can. Baseball, football, soccer, all these cross crawl, push pull patterns that are needed to play golf. If you come to the table proficient in those, then you're way ahead of the game. If you are if you have a background where your body is not really prepared for the stresses and the rigors of tournament golf, and you're playing AJGA schedules and all of these things, it's only it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when the body is going to break down. So I think when you come to the table with really high level patterns and you cross over to golf, it's much better than just coming to the table cold and relying on different skills to play at a really high level golf.
Yeah, I think from my standpoint, Mike, I completely agree with you. And if I were to go one level deeper, with my experience with athletes is that by far work capacity, having sport specific coordination patterns, and then being able to generate speed would be my three big buckets there. And I feel very strongly that that could be applied into most other sports, but particularly golf, that does have a high level of technical proficiency that is needed, that is very closely tied into the physicality of it. And I think if you took your extreme elite in the sport of golf, they would have those three buckets checked pretty well, in my opinion. They might
Yeah.
not necessarily be the strongest if we start to pull into some other periphery buckets. They're going to be strong enough though. They're going to be strong enough, but they're going to be able to generate speed. They're going to have really good coordination patterns for the sport of golf, and they're going to be able to repeat that pattern over a long duration. And that's where, in my world, from work capacity, that's the key move. It's not taxing to play 18 holes of golf for most athletic people, but the repeating of the motor skill over and over again is where the work capacity, in my opinion, is the trump card.
Yeah, 100%. As you know, as well as anybody, the body learns stability, mobility, then coordination, then strength and power, right? We build on top of those blocks. But yeah, being proficient in those first three levels of having some sort of stability, having the mobility needed, which kids don't generally have an issue with unless there's some really crazy patterns. But and then the coordination is typically coming from some other sport that has similar patterns that's needed, right? The golf swing happens in under a second, right? Think of how ballistic that motion is, and then at impact, all of the forces that we're creating throughout the motion, it's like 7-8 times the body weight of that person, right? So impact is a car crash essentially, and I don't think that we are really focused enough on the body and the forces that it's absorbing. It's a lot of speed. But we go back to time, right? And this thing happening in under a second. Those are really, really specific patterns that are happening, right? To deliver the golf club to the golf ball. And what I see for sure, the trend is speed with golf. They're really, how best to say it, but when we start adding speed, the scary part about speed is it doesn't have a direction, right? We start talking about acceleration and velocities of segments in the golf clubs and angular velocity of the golf club. All of these things are producing, force. It's mass times velocity over time, right? So when we move the golf club within time, a specific amount of time, there's ground reaction forces, there's rotational velocities, there's gravity, right? That's all of these things that are putting pressure on the body. And I think we need to really better understand how to take care of the body, how to move the body in a very safe way, yet a really high performing way in this ballistic motion that happens in under a second, and then have the body be very prepared to absorb all of those forces that we're putting on it.
And I think, Mike, you've hit the nose on the head. What I find, if you improve a person's coordination patterns, you will see the trickle over effect in their efficiency, which results with speed output. So it's like, from my standpoint, we want to go first at the neurological system. Let's make gains with that. And then you might see some of those benefits around things, as you pointed out, that most people are chasing with speed and power, as opposed to let's just throw some speed and power on top of a poor movement pattern, right? They don't have that base level requirement of mobility, stability in the right sequence and order that are needed for the golf swing. And then essentially, as you mentioned, it's kind of a bit of a car crash, and then you're just having to manage the car crash a little bit, which speaks to your other point, which I think is very good, is then it's like, well, what's the recovery strategies that player has in place? It's when they're looking at sleep, nutrition, hydration, any other sort of recovery strategies, hot, cold baths, to just manage the fact that swinging a golf club at a high level places a lot of stress on the body. So
yeah, what's crazy to me is that in golf coaching today, we still talk about, we still communicate the golf swing as though it happens in the same amount of time as a 12-second slow motion video at 240 frames, right? At P7, we want to be here. At P4, we want to be here. And I'm like, this is crazy that we're actually communicating to people that they're going to get better at this motion that happens in under a second by stopping them and talking about a position or an orientation that they should be in at a point in time that's about a hundredth of a second
Mm-hmm.
long,
Yeah.
right? And so I just am very careful with the way that, I train athletes and I communicate to them, because I just feel like, if your body, to your point, and your brain is not coordinating these motor units to run this kinetic chain to hit this golf ball in under a second, then you're not going to see a whole lot of improvement in your athletes.
And I think, Mike, with spending a lot of time with you and other really smart people in the world of biomechanics, I now know, and through testing and with myself and athletes, know that I think the environment is the king. And in our world as coaches, and I think you hit it beautifully here, can we set up an environment with both the tool, and maybe we can speak to that in a second, and what the task is that the coach is essentially asking the player to do will create that change in movement, which is very much in line with what you were just talking about there. And that's what I think, if we look at how other sports are learned, that's essentially what gets done. You're either changing the tool or you're changing the environment to get your change in how the body moves, or the change in the outcome, which is really, in the sports world, what you're looking for. I need to shoot the puck at a different angle. So, it's a tool, it's the way the drill is organized, or it's where the player's attention is upon to make that sort of work. So
Yeah, and to
another
add to that, the surface, the surface that we play on is, a determining factor on what we can and cannot do, right? So on ice, it's incredibly important that you have center of mass over base of support, or you're on your butt.
Yes.
And you have all of these things happening around you in your environment. So you think about the neurological patterns that you've created, as well as the physical patterns. And then the technical patterns, to me, are just a resultant of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like what you're saying, your point is, if we set up the environment for these athletes to train, then their technical patterns that we spend so much time and energy on, the amount of data we talk about, and low point, shaft angle, and swing plane, and path, those are all resultants. They're not the cause of what's happening. So I just think that, we need to really look at the training environment that we set up for these athletes. And to be quite honest, their level of success is going to be directly linked to the type of environment, the type of training environment we set up for them.
And I think, maybe just to close here, Mike, I would say, from my standpoint, one ask for players to help set up a better training environment for them would be to remove the shoe. I would say, if we remove the shoe, and then instead of having the foot working in this stable sort of platform, we're going to remove that. And then, if you really want the next step with it, take the foot and put it on something that's a little more unstable. I.e., we were talking beautifully about what happens and how the athlete self-organizes in the context of hockey, when we have a very slippery surface and we have a hockey skate that, albeit is very stable, but the bottom of the hockey skate is extremely narrow and unstable. And what beautiful things happen,
I'm balancing on a blade, right? I'm balancing on a blade that is running through the center of my foot, right in between the third and fourth metatarsal, right? So I've got this boot sitting on top of this thing, and I have to balance on this blade on this sheet of ice and shoot a puck, or to get hit when I'm not falling over. I would say the thing the story I always tell is, I grew up in Northern Ontario, as you know, Sudbury, more specifically Lively, Ontario. So there's not much to do other than play hockey, right? And we had a golf course that my best buddy, who's now a PJ Tour caddy, he lived on, right? And he was my goalie in my hockey team. and it was hockey for 8 months out of the year. When you weren't in your playing season, you were training or playing another sport, because playing another sport was a form of training for hockey.
Yeah,
Playing
yeah.
baseball, playing football, playing all these other sports, right, were all a form of training for hockey. And so when I look back now as a coach and I think about how sophisticated those patterns are when you come to the table, we would honestly, and still to this day, I could go home to Lively, Ontario, and the boys that have been playing beer league hockey all winter, have not touched a golf club in 8 months, could go out and shoot even par for fun in their sleep. So I think about the environment, the competitive environment that I grew up in, and even more specifically for me as a player, um, I would roll up to the first tee and we didn't have a driving range. So I'd be standing on the first tee making some swings and it was a dog leg left. And I already knew how to shape the ball right to left. And I hadn't hit a golf ball in 8, 9 months, right? Why is that? Why could I, why could my brain already see the shape of a golf ball moving around a corner in a direction? And that was no different with a fade. A
Mhm.
hole moving the opposite way, it was the exact same thing. So that is what is the root of my curiosity, right? And meeting Mike Bentley and just the amount of work he's done over the last 30 years, it just really made a lot of sense to me because I had gone through it as an athlete. So now my expectations for the athletes that come to me is that I want them to experience these same type of patterns.
Yeah, and I think Mike, you hit the nose on the head again there with, if you look at, if you take another athlete within another sport and put them into the context of golf, they have a lot of those asks that we've been talking about already imprinted. So then the technical skills that are needed within this other sport that has a lot of tie-ins to any other rotary sport, whether you're hockey or baseball or lacrosse, it's like it's there. And
Tennis, yeah, yeah.
tennis, any of those sort of things, you know?
It's funny, right? That's the cool thing about being a coach is they come to the table with these patterns, and you're figuring out what the level of these patterns are. I would say an ice hockey player has more sophisticated patterns than a baseball player, even though it's a rotary sport. I'd say as far as patterns go, I'd say ice hockey players are at the top of the totem pole for golf patterns, right? We see it all the time, like NHL players. It's like pick it up and they have no problem hitting the center of the face of a golf club, right? Baseball players, you know, playing on a different plane, tennis players, lacrosse, all these things. There's a certain level where it starts to drop off, right? They're playing in a different plane of motion. Their brains are, you know, not formed the same way as a ball being on the ground. It doesn't start from a static position.
Yeah, yeah.
There's a lot of different things, a lot of different variables, right? But it's really cool to see multi-sport athletes come to golf. I think that's why it really drew me to it, because it's kind of a central breeding ground for all these different types of athletes that want to play golf.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And certainly up in Canada, as you know, there's so many players that are playing hockey and reaching some level with it and realizing that they might not be, the next Connor McDavid. And then it's like,
Yeah,
oh, I've got these cool patterns that I could use in this other sport that's pretty closely connected. And we see them be extremely elite, right? And I think
for
that
sure.
leads to a beautiful point that we started with, the idea that, if you can, change the surface, let's understand that, change the tool. Instead of the golf club, you're shooting hockey pucks and hitting baseballs and doing it with, some of the objects on your wall there that have a little more spring to them. Watch what might now happen with how the body moves and how beautifully it takes care of a lot of the things that we're trying to take care of with technique, just in maybe the most efficient way. And I think from my standpoint, there's no, and I know you agree, right or wrong way to go about it. I think what we've discussed today might be the most more efficient way to do it, and particularly an efficient way that's going to ensure the longevity of that player within the sport. So, i.e., the early specializer, the young player that does a lot of golf and gets really nice equipment and does a lot of reps at a very early age, unfortunately, most of the time they won't, as you know, be doing that at a high level when they're 30, unfortunately. And that's very clear
Yeah.
in every sport,
Yeah.
particularly golf, you know? So I think that's wonderful, Mike. And I'd offer any maybe just closing thoughts from your standpoint before we shut it down here.
Yeah, I'd say just in that vein of thought, you know, there are a few things that are never going to change. Our feet are going to be connected to the ground while we play the sport. So if you make those patterns as sophisticated as you can, you're going to have success. When you fix the feet that are connected to the ground, then you're going to optimize the kinetic chain, which is then going to optimize the distal segments of how the hands are connected to the golf club. So with the feet being on the ground and the hands being connected to the golf club and the golf ball being on the ground, those are going to be three constants that are not going to change. So if you work backwards and train from the ground out, you're going to have some success.
I love it. Mike, thanks so much for your time with that wonderful insights, and have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, buddy. Same to you.
Thanks, Mike.
See ya.